Okay, here we go. All right. My name is Catherine Parnell, and I'm with Birch Bark Editing. And it is my great pleasure to be with you at the beginning of December, of the end of 2023, to welcome two really fabulous writers. And a few announcements very, very, very quickly. Birch Bark Editing also hosts Microlit Almanac. And we've just announced a number of nominations for different end of year awards. We also have a mix and meet group that meets the first Tuesday of every month. Our next meeting will be Tuesday, January 9th in 2024. It's a little hard to believe. Now, the really great thing about our event this evening is that we are collaborating with Journal of the Month Club. And so whoever is here this evening will be throwing your name in a virtual hat. And at the end of the event, we'll pull one name out of that hat, and that person will receive a 4-month subscription to Journal of the Month Club. So that's a pretty good holiday gift. And I know this is a difficult time for all of us. It's a time of war, Israel, Gaza, Ukraine, and I hope that you will all keep that in your thoughts as you're considering what to do about any holiday gifts or monies or anything like that. I'm sure there are organizations that you can find out there that you'd be willing to support. So we have two really fabulous writers who will be reading for us this evening. The first one is Brian Turner. He is the author of five poetry collections. Here, Bullet to The Wild Delight of Wild Things, and a memoir, My Life as a Foreign Country. He's also the editor of The Kiss and co-editor of The Strangest of Theater's anthologies. He's a musician. He has also written and recorded several albums with the Interplanetary Acoustic Team, including 11 Me Smiling and the Retro Legion's American Undertow. You've got to listen to these things. They're great. His poems and essays have been published widely. He's a Guggenheim Fellow, and he's received a USA Hillcrest Fellowship in Literature, the Amy Lowell Traveling Fellowship, the Poets Prize, and a fellowship from the Lannan Foundation. He lives in Orlando, Florida, with his dog Dean, the world's sweetest golden retriever. Our other reader is Jehanne Dubrow, the author of 9 poetry collections. Let's see, nine, including most recently Wild Kingdom, and 2 books of creative nonfiction, Through Smoke and Haste, a book of small bites. Her third collection of nonfiction is Exhibitions, Essays on Art and Atrocity, and it was published by the University of New Mexico Press earlier this year. Her writing has appeared in Poetry, New England Review, and many others. It's my great pleasure to welcome Brian and Jehanne, and Brian will start things off by reading. Welcome, Brian.
Thanks so much, Kat, and Max, and everybody here, and John. What a pleasure to get to read with you again. It's through Zoom, of course. I think the last time we read together was at Annapolis, right? When we were in that weird room when they were all above it. We were in the basketball court or something, and they had all these cadets looking down, and it was like it felt very Roman somehow. I don't know exactly, but it was wonderful to read with you then. I can't wait to see you again in person. And congratulations on your latest book. For all of you here, I don't know if you know this, but I've been a long time fan of Jeanne's work, and in the middle lit community, and I can see there are several folks here that are part of that tribe. Of course, Jehanne is so well known in the tribe, but your work just is. Your curiosity seems to pull you in so many different directions. I'm always curious to see what the next book will be, what the next meditation, where you'll lead us. So it's an honor to get to read with you tonight. For all those who are here, I'm gonna try and put it on gallery view so I can see everybody. But I'm gonna read a longer piece and then a very short piece. The first one is I think they're both difficult, so I hope you got some coffee or tea or whatever it is, and thank you for indulging me with this reading. This piece is called Ashes, Ashes. California is on fire, and the beauty of it is undeniable. The ash content in the atmosphere creates gorgeous sunsets over the still waters of Lake Tahoe, where I stand on its northern shore, considering the aperture settings on my camera, the precise amount of light to harvest through a polarized filter. I dream of ash falling. The parts per million, forest and plant life reduced to cellulose, resins, starches, tannins, hydrocarbons, carbon dioxide, water vapor. An entire forest lifted into the blue ether and held aloft just long enough for the sunlight to consider it once more, as if nostalgic for what once was, as if listening for the birds that sang in those high canopies, or the San Joaquin kit fox lifting its head to call on a silent god in the star fields above. Sagittarius watches on, as does the asteroid 2012 Hephaestus, seated in a smithy of light. The longest burning fire on Earth is located some 200 miles north of Sydney, Australia, at Burning Mountain. It's an underground coal seam fire estimated to be 6,000 years old. According to legend, a widow implored one of the gods to kill her because her sadness was too great to bear. The god refused and instead turned her to stone. It said that tears of fire fell from her and that the fire pooled beneath her inside the earth. Her figure reclines along the ridge of the mountain to this day. It is her great and enduring loss that burns century by century. Of course, our home, Earth, rests on a mantle of molten metal, basaltic, andesitic, rhyolitic magma. If we live long enough and if we care enough, each of us will lie down in our own stony silence with a pool of fire below. My father's body was transported to the crematorium during the first week of September 2015. We were told there would be a few days until the mortician could cremate him because there was a backlog of clients queued up ahead. I tried to picture the space, that small warehouse of the dead awaiting transfiguration, and an underground grotto came to mind, like the catacombs of Rome or the dusty underworld of Paris, only this was Fresno. And so I imagined a modest-sized gallery, a few torches lighting the tableau, and the dead, of course, lying side by side, luminescent in their silence. My father, white-haired and stern-faced, surely irked by the ineptitude of the work taking place around him, remaining attentive to the sound of the oven door rising open like a guillotine and sliding shut. Or maybe it resembled the inside of a bullet, something pointed toward God and given ignition. I imagined the lifting of bodies, the last words sometimes, one last check for rings or false teeth or anything forged in metal before the bed glides into that final housing. Gloved hands backing away. Then the chamber's intake of oxygen, the roar of fire muffled by sheets of metal and the gaseous residue that lingers in the air afterward. A fire of such intensity, even vapor is broken down at the molecular level and electrons pushed out into distant shells, the way planets drift further and further away from a sun that's lost its gravitational pull. My father's body, singular and human, given to the air. Cremation normally takes place during business hours. That fact alone goes against my imagination, which pictures the practice as a duty for the graveyard shift. Instead, the ovens are brushed out and heated up as coffee percolates in the break room. The dead, wrapped in blue plastic bags, are boxed in cardboard that is taped shut and then housed on storage racks. Normally, the mortician will slide one of the boxes from the rack onto a stainless steel table with metal casters before wheeling it onto a scale for measurement and then on into the cremation room itself. They wear latex gloves throughout this part of the procedure, as well as surgical masks and headgear, but once inside the cremation room, they don Kevlar with aluminum backing, gloves that can withstand 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Once the body is fully inserted into the chamber, the operator depresses a button and the outer door slides down to seal the heat within. There's a small viewport, a kind of spyglass into the body's undoing. And those who haven't witnessed a cremation are most often captivated by what they see. It's the beauty of the fire that draws the eye, the signature of the body stripped of form through a travail of fire, the reduction, the incineration, the disappearance. Not the metal rakes or the carbon steel bristles afterward, not the processing station with its rotary saw blades. It's the fire that pulls us in. Within the confines of welded steel, jets of flame work to turn tissue and fluid and bone into ash. The temperature needs to reach between 1400 to 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, and it often takes a little over 2 hours to complete this stage of the task. The boxes glow in the fire. They ember and brighten. And as much as I try not to, I can't help but imagine my father's skull at 1600 degrees Fahrenheit, with twin rivers of flame rising through the orbits of his eyes. The world is trying to teach me about dying, something about the covalent bond, the narrative of the body inhabited by the soul, about the canvas of dead stars burning in the heavens above. 2. I slept with your ashes the night you came home. I knew it was morbid and pitiful, but I curled around the box and cried and talked with you, and at some point, exhausted, fell asleep. Actually, that's wrong. I didn't think it was morbid or pitiful. I curled around you and held you as best I could. It made no sense at all, and yet it made complete sense. The carved wooden Buddha at the corner of the room glowed in candlelight, and those small flames shifted gently from left to right as if a hand calmly passed over them. And the Buddha's face warmed in the slow-moving waves of heat radiating from the candlelight below. A sharp and unmistakable jab to my ribcage startled me awake. It was so sudden I found myself sitting upright, searching across the room. I distinctly heard your voice, just before being jabbed, saying, "Get up." I even sensed your frustration, as if you'd been trying to wake me for some time. I've awakened to the fact that my life is on fire. My house is on fire. The grass in the yard is made of green tongues of flame, just as the banana leaves unfurl in flame and the angel trumpet bells open in petals of fire. It's not something I would have ever thought possible, not even remotely, but you get used to the heat. The window blinds ripple and furl with rays of sunlight burning through. The faucet in the sink filters a gel of fire to fill the glass I drink from as I watch the cardinals through the kitchen window. The roofing pops and cracks in fire day after day, while the yellow rain tree leans over, almost comforting, its branches flushed with songbirds. The brightness is a different story. The glare off the windows keeps me up at night. The neighbors pause on their front doorsteps to note the natural ebb and flow of this fire, like scientists charting a coal seam blaze. The firelight reflects off other people's faces. At the coffee shop, the barista accepts my change before observing the residue of ash it leaves on her palms, then smiles professionally while inwardly questioning how I don't just kneel down and turn to cinders and dust right there on the spot. I'm the man on fire who lives in a house of fire. I begin to perceive a few others like me, others who pass by on the sidewalk or drive by in their cars, and there's a moment of recognition, a trail of smoke in their wake. We burn, we smolder, but there's nothing for me to learn from them. And what could I possibly say that might prove of any worth to them? My life is on fire. Green tongues of flame burn all around me. So it's a lyric essay I think of in this book called The Wild Delight of Wild Things. I probably should have told you ahead of time. It would have been helpful. I don't know if you know, or if you're able to catch, there's a shift in that when I went into the second part, I was initially talking about my father, and then I shifted to a conversation with my wife, Elise, the poet, Elise Kuznets. If it's not too much, maybe you can put a link to her books. She's with Alice James Books. She passed or crossed over in the year 2016 after living with cancer for almost 4 years. But a beautiful poet. There's 2 books there you can find, and you can meet her yourself there. I hope I haven't gone on too long, but I would like to, if I can, I'll read one short poem, and then I'll hand it off to Jehanne, who can save us. I've hopefully caused a little bit of interest here, but I'm really excited to hear from your book, Jehanne. This poem is from the Dead Peasant's Handbook. I had the 3 books come out this fall, and this is the 3rd of those 3 books. And this is the opening poem from that book. sunflowers. What they don't tell you about war is how much a bank ledger might shape a decision tree. The price of fuel, sunflower oil, durable goods when they're floating on an ocean with no delivery in sight. That bullets can skip along the surface of a wall like stone over water. That it's a bad idea to tape the sheet glass windows of your home, but smart to roll down the windows of a car when fleeing a firefight. That you should open your mouth to avoid rupturing your eardrums when a shockwave rolls by. That civilians are the bravest of all. See how they face the invaders, saying, take these seeds and put them in your pockets, so at least sunflowers will grow when you all lie down here. What they don't tell you about war is that a soldier's oath is not only to be the one who puts out the fire, but to be the one who starts the fire to begin with, to be the one who carves a hollow center deep into the word suffering. War is born of the obscene, a disfiguration of words like love or humanity. This much we know. These things we do, these ghosts we live with, how they call out to us sometimes, asking for water. Such a simple thing, a glass of water. Thank you all very much for listening and for being here. I'd like to hand it over to my friend, Jehanne. I'm looking forward to hearing what you'll read for us tonight. So.
Thank you so much, Brian. I think most of you probably know that Brian is one of the kindest and most generous people in the literary world. So it's always a pleasure to read with you, Brian. And I have a very vivid memory of that reading we did together in the Naval Academy basketball stadium. It's one of the strangest readings I think I've ever done. So I'm going to be reading an excerpt from an essay from my most recent book, Exhibitions, Essays on Art and Atrocity. And the book is mostly comprised of essays that focus on specific works of art, often using those pieces of art as jumping off points for meditating on horror and our relationship to beauty. I'm the daughter of two American Foreign Service officers. I was born in Italy, and I grew up in Yugoslavia, Zaire, Poland, Belgium, Austria, and occasionally in the United States. So the essay that I'm going to read from is called The Red Picture and the Blue. Content information. It is about the former Yugoslavia and the genocide that occurred there. And I'm going to be reading a passage about sexual assault. I just wanted to prepare you for that. I'm going to show you very quickly one of the paintings to which I'm referring in the essay. So this is the blue picture, and it's by the Bosnian Muslim painter Mirsad Berber, one of the most important painters of that region. This is a painting that my parents own, and it's one of the two sort of graces that hovers over this essay. The other painting I don't have a great picture of, so I won't show you, but that's the red painting, and it's a very fierce and kind of angry painting in opposition to that blue one. So this is a few paragraphs in. I've been speaking about the red painting and the blue. I've been talking about Mirsad Berber. Throughout my childhood, the two women in the paintings watched me like a pair of tranquil guardians from their elevated positions on the wall of the dining room. They were there through hundreds of evening meals, the many afternoons I did my homework at the long table that seated 8. In college, when I read Plato's Phaedrus for the first time, I thought about the two horses in the red painting, the pale one rearing back, attempting to escape the frame, and the other a muscular shadow leaning over to nip the neck of its companion. In the case of the human soul, Plato writes, first of all, it is a pair of horses that the charioteer dominates. One of them is noble and handsome and of good breeding, while the other is the very opposite, so that our charioteer necessarily has a difficult and troublesome task. Throughout my childhood, too, we lived in places that might have been called divided. Consider the linguistic discord of Belgium, the international push-pull over Zaire's natural resources, and Poland, which so often throughout its history was merely territory to be invaded by the armies of its powerful neighbors. But no country seemed more divided than Yugoslavia, its soul dragged in opposing directions like a chariot pulled by a pair of antagonistic horses. My parents speak about how much they loved their time in Belgrade and Zagreb. They remember the roasted meats, the assertive green of the olive oils, the sturdy, rough table wines. The people were so warm, they tell me. But my mother says it was unwise to mention the Croats to the Serbs or the Serbs to the Croats. Then she explains the response was always those terrible, terrible people. Most Americans can't understand this kind of long historical memory, both sides talking about battles that occurred 800 years before, as if the wars had happened yesterday. For nearly 40 years until his death in 1980, the dictator known as Tito governed Yugoslavia, a nation state composed of 6 distinct socialist republics: Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, and Slovenia. Named president for life in 1974, Tito kept strict control of the country and tamped down on ancient ethnic conflicts. By the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, Yugoslavia was moving toward dissolution, communist rule no longer a restraint on old, well-tended hatreds. What followed the rise of nationalism in the former Yugoslavia were wars in Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Kosovo, as well as conflicts in Macedonia and the Preševo Valley. The worst of the violence was called ethnic cleansing, a term that ensured the United States and other nations could avoid the kind of intervention that might have been necessitated by labeling the crimes genocide. By 1993, when the war was already well underway in Yugoslavia, we were posted to Brussels. One night, my mother told us that in addition to the bombings, the sieges of towns, the mass disappearances of civilians, there were now rumors of rapes emerging from the territories of the former Yugoslavia. No, there were rumors of rape camps. And my mother, with her excellent language skills and her knowledge of the region, had been identified as a suitable representative to fly to Zagreb and to interview Bosnian refugees. In an unpublished essay she once wrote for a creative writing workshop, my mother recounts how she felt at the time. When I received a message from a former State Department colleague that my name had come up on the language database as a possible team leader, I had shoved the cable aside and tried to ignore it. Over dinner, we discussed if my mother should take the assignment. "I don't want to go," my mother said. My father stayed silent, and although I have no memory of this conversation, my mother writes that I told her, "Mommy, if you don't go, somebody else will have to. And what if that person doesn't believe the women?" Believe the women. I would have been barely 17 when I said this. In her essay, my mother hypothesizes that I knew women could be disbelieved because I had heard her own story from 30 years before. When she was 19 and living in Miami, my mother was held hostage by a man who had escaped from an institution, the kind of place that used to be called an asylum for the criminally insane. For nearly a day, he held her at knife point in her own apartment, saying over and over, "Tell me a story. Tell me why I shouldn't kill you." My mother obeyed. She told him about the college classes she was taking. She pointed to the textbooks that lay open on the dining room table. She bandaged the man's hand, which she had cut in the struggle after he broke into her rooms. "Tell me a story," he said. "Tell me why I shouldn't kill you." She offered to cook him dinner. Spaghetti and meatballs, she suggested, knowing she didn't have those ingredients in her kitchen, that they would have to walk to the grocery store, and that the store stood across the street from a police station. She took a purse from the closet. Its sides were sturdy, the bottom studded with 4 metal feet. She placed her shopping list inside the bag. And when my mother finally managed to get away from the man, knocking him over with the sudden strike of the purse, she ran and ran. In the police station, her face and neck and wrists still bruised from his fingers, the officers on duty didn't believe the story she told. Women like this were always coming in to complain about their boyfriend's fists. Go home, they told her. Just tell him you're sorry and won't do it again. And this is why my mother decided to go to Yugoslavia, to listen to the women. There had been shelling in the suburbs outside of Zagreb, but the war was mostly felt in other ways within the city. Refugees were everywhere, and hyperinflation rapidly changed the price of a cup of coffee or a loaf of bread from one day to the next. It was cold in Zagreb. My mother had packed thermal underwear, sweaters, a thick scarf to wear indoors if the power flickered out. On some days, she and the team interviewed women in the offices of NGOs or in the makeshift spaces of refugee camps. They went to hospitals, often sitting with women in the psychiatric wings. Depending on a woman's health, how hurt her body, how abraded her speech, an interview might last 4, 6, even 8 hours. Or the conversation would become too difficult and my mother would sit quietly in a nearby chair while nurses or doctors shuffled through the corridors beyond. And although my mother, a gifted linguist, spoke Serbo-Croatian, she brought a translator with her to each interview, the pace of the conversation halting and stumbling as questions and answers were mediated through translation. My mother wanted it this way. She wanted to construct a small artificial barrier of language so that the women's trauma might take longer to reach her. I was quite certain, she wrote, that the stories I would hear would be devastating. I needed to make sure that my emotions did not interfere with getting the facts. Interviews began with slow, careful introductions. This is who we are. We understand you might have a story. We are interested in hearing your story, but only if you feel comfortable telling us. Tell us about your life before the war. Tell us about your town. Did you know your neighbors? And later on in the conversation, did you know any of your captors? Do you remember a name? How were the women and girls separated from the men? Where were you taken? The work of the team was to collect testimony for the UN's War Tribunal, patterns of abuse pointing to the systematic use of rape as part of the Serbs' genocidal practices against their Bosnian neighbors needed to emerge carefully from the interviews. The questions could not lead, could not force an answer, must be able to stand up to scrutiny in an international court of law. My mother stayed in Zagreb approximately 6 weeks. Each night when the interviews were done, she came back to the hotel to work on her notes. The embassy had given her a secure typewriter. After she transcribed each interview, she locked the pages and the typewriter ribbon in the safe in her room. My mother has never been a drinker. Instead, she took a long shower, trying to wash the words from her skin. She went to bed, although she seldom fell asleep easily. She hadn't been raped by the man who held her hostage decades before, but my mother couldn't help remembering her own story when she heard the Bosnian women recounting theirs, his hands around her neck, how he kept saying, tell me a story, tell me why I shouldn't kill you. Thank you.
Oh, Brian, Jeanne, that was really superb. And I know you have questions for one another, so we'll give you a few minutes to have a conversation. Thank you.
I think, John, ahead of time, didn't we plan to have like an awkward silence just to make it fun? But
Yes. Okay, awkward silence.
Okay. Now I have one just immediate question. I'm still sort of absorbing what you've just read, and to hear it aloud adds another texture to the reading. But on a very small craft kind of part, the quoted passage you had from your mother's essay that she wrote years ago, how did that come to? Because I incorporated some emails in a memoir that I wrote from family members, and there was some interesting things that I learned in that process, and I'm wondering, what was that process like for you, having conversations with your mom now, but also her younger self, maybe, and having that documentary evidence too.
Yeah, so I always think of my mom as a kind of collaborator in a lot of my work. She's one of the great heroes of my writing. And fortunately, I'm very lucky that she is willing and happy to talk about even the most difficult matters. So she's very used to my calling her up and saying, I'm going back over this passage, I have a question. And I remember when she took a class in nonfiction long before I started writing nonfiction at the Bethesda Writer Center outside of Washington, D.C. And I remember reading this essay that she wrote in an early form, and then she never did anything with it. And so years later, when I was working on this essay, I asked her, I remembered about this piece, and I asked her if she would be willing to share it with me again, and if I might use something directly from the essay. And I was very lucky, and she said yes.
Gotcha. I think there's a couple of questions for you already over in the chat here, but so I hope we don't lose those as we're talking. But maybe
No, we won't.
Okay, yeah.
Brian, will you talk about your use of sections as a way of moving through different voices or different modes in the piece that you read?
Sure. I think part of it was helping me to sort of, in one sense, there were well, I initially had the essay written where there were asterisks or like wingdings or symbols between maybe a portion. And so there's section 1 has many of these sort of interior sections, meditations inside of them. And there's no connective tissue between them. There's no and that makes me think of, there's none of that kind of like linguistic connective tissue between those portions. When we went to publish this book, Carrie Salerno, the editor at Alice James, I thought she had a brilliant idea, which, she said, why don't we take those symbols out and then just, they fit nicely on a page, each of them. None of them needed more than a page. So it worked out nicely to have these, you have a page, you read it, then there's a breath and you read the next page. And I think like I'm not sure if you started as a poet. I've never asked you that question. Yeah, so I love when poets go from, and I know you've written poetry and then, but when poets go from poetry to essays. And one of the reasons I love it is because I think the practice of poetry teaches a kind of, or ingrains a kind of trust in the synaptic gap of the silence between stanzas, and that the reader provides the glue and the connective tissue, and that we don't always have to have that bridge work of language to make one thing connect to another, and knowing that the reader's brilliant and that's part of the joy of reading, that they'll participate in the construction of meaning, all that kind of stuff, right? So I thought her idea was really brilliant to put on separate pages like that instead of these really awkward little symbols and stuff. And then the first part is about my father, and I wrote that as an essay and published it in the Georgia Review. There were other sections that were part of it, or other portions that ended up being edited out. But and Elise helped me edit that. So she was reading this about cremation while she was fighting cancer, and we were having this conversation going on, in the text in a lot of ways, and about my father, and it was kind of the only way I could grieve him, because he died in 2015 and she passed away a year later. So during that fall of 2015, I was writing this essay, but we both were, fearful of this. And I didn't realize that, because I wasn't living for this, but I ended up having to write a second section. And now I'm wondering, because my mother passed away in October, and I feel like I might have to write another section of this essay. And that's, so there might be a third, or I think it would be in between, and I have to put it in between with my father, then my mother, and then Elise. But I'm not really sure. I'm still trying to think my way through that. Yeah. Do you mind I hope you don't mind this, but on like sort of a bird's eye view, can we sort of take the dirigible up and then look down at your book from a large scale and see like how do you think, how'd you get into this book? How did it begin? And I know they're linked essays, but can you talk a bit about that structure?
Thank you for asking. That's a wonderful question. So in some ways, this is actually my second book of nonfiction, even though it came out third. I had written a book-length essay called Through Smoke, which was about how I fell in love with the sense of smell and perfume. And that book was a way that I tricked myself into learning how to write nonfiction, because it's made up of hundreds of little paragraphs, which could easily be called prose poems. And so after I wrote that book, and I thought, well, I guess I'm now writing nonfiction too, I thought, well, I want to try to learn how to work in a longer form. And that felt really hard to me, I think, especially as a poet. And so initially my task was, can I write an essay that's over 4,000 words? And that was the initial prompt that I gave to myself. But very quickly, I started thinking about how I grew up in a home where there were so many pieces of art on the walls because my parents were collectors, and how personal the stories were, and how so much of that art was connected to landscapes troubled by violent history. Because we lived in so many places that were haunted by war and genocide. And so initially I was just, trying to write. I began by writing an essay about a famous Polish weaver named Magdalena Abakanowicz. And that essay didn't even end up in the book. But, I was just trying to think of like, how do I take this ekphrasis, which I love in poetry, writing about visual art, and translate it into the essay. I'm writing a craft book right now on trauma. It's called The Wounded Line, A Guide to Writing Poems of Trauma. And I'm essentially providing 20 chapters on different techniques that you can use to write about trauma in ethical and artistically effective ways. And one of those chapters is on ekphrastic poetry. And my thesis is, when we write about a piece of visual art, the first thing we do, as we all know if we've ever done this prompt, is we step back and we write about the piece of art, and we're sort of engaging in a kind of clinical curatorial point of view. We describe the art, we say what we're seeing, but inevitably the poem or the essay can't stay there in the act of pure description. It usually has to turn back toward the self. But because we're already using this detached clinical voice of the viewer examining a work of art, when we turn back toward the self, we're able to maintain that same clinical distance. And so it's a really useful technique for writing about trauma in a more detached clinical manner, although there are many ways to write about trauma the way you do, for instance, in the piece that you read, that's deeply immersive and kind of mimics the state of the traumatized body and mind. And so that's a lot of what I was thinking about in this book as well, was like, how do we represent trauma through these engagements with visual works of art? And what do we do with the problem that so often beauty exists adjacent to horror, which is a problem that I think we all struggle with. Like, any of us who are alive on September 11th, 2001, remember on the East Coast what a beautiful day that was. And most of the time that feels like it should not be the case. If trauma is happening, the weather should be horrible to reflect what we're experiencing internally.
Yeah, it's true though, right? Because like, being in a time of war, I've sometimes written about going down to like Starbucks, and here in Florida, there's often these plastic, there's plenty of palm trees, but they still put plastic palm trees outside of Starbucks, and they'll put these little speakers, and they've got Kenny G playing the saxophone, and I've got my fancy coffee drink, and it's just right, and they made it perfect this morning. And but the dissociative effect of living this very privileged and comfortable life and knowing that there's horrific things happening, and how do I navigate that, both in my life and then in art too? So if there's a piece we're writing about, and that has to do with trauma, when, like, as you were just talking about, when the language is beautiful, I worry sometimes that it might have the effect of romance, right? It's seductive in the sense that it might pull some to be, because like it might be, as I said, it's fire that draws the eye. And that's the thing I worry about, is that there's sort of rubbernecking towards trauma, and this idea of like, it's almost easy to write about trauma in some ways, and create art about trauma and have an audience. But what to what end, right? Like, what the worry I have is that if I create art that's pornographic in a sense, that feels some type of vicarious pleasure or intense curiosity that might in some ways feed pathology and feed the actions that will then create it to happen again. You know, like if there are younger folks who might read it and then want to go into the military or something in a very practical way, rather than trying to create a department of instead of Department of Defense, but a Department of Peace Studies for the United States government, right? Like, where's that department? You know, I'm drifting a bit there, but on a practical level, I wanted to circle back, if you don't mind, because on a very craft related level, we're talking about this idea of, sometimes I think of myself as a sprinter, as a poet. And when I shift over to nonfiction, I usually know that I'm a sprinter. That's my mode. But I try to use that to my advantage, but then create a kind of Frankenstein. Like, how can I put pieces enough together to create this body, this book that has a larger meditative space to it? And I'm wondering, how did you do with that 4,000 word assignment? And then where's it going from there for you? Does that Frankenstein metaphor seem apt to you, or is that?
I think so. I mean, I think that I'm really, for me, I like to shift between research, theory, personal essay, and the lyric mode. I'm hoping in the end it doesn't feel like a monster pieced together, but I definitely am very aware during the drafting process that there's a moment where I'll say, okay, now you've been engaging in personal essay for too long. It's time to widen the aperture and bring in historical research, or, you know, this particular voice has been going on for too long. I don't want to be indulgent. Let me shift modes now. So yeah, that really, I think, resonates for me as well. And that especially maybe as poets moving toward lyric essay, that we're comfortable doing those modal shifts, because poems so often do that within the space of a line. And maybe we don't even interrogate it, but it's such a natural gesture in poetry.
You know, a couple of people have already mentioned about research, and you just brought up research too. Do you have a process for your research, or can you see patterns over the course of your writing life of how you incorporate research into your work?
In fact, usually I don't know if this has been your experience, but for me, often the research is what teaches me what the essay is really about. So for instance, in exhibitions, there's an essay where I'm writing about these antique Art Nouveau pieces of glass that my parents collected in Belgium. And I was trying to write about what it was like for us to be in Belgium while the Rwandan genocide was going on, because my mother was very involved in sort of the triangulation of Belgian, Rwandan, American interests during that period. And I was researching Art Nouveau and how Art Nouveau flourished, for instance, in Belgium during the early 20th century as a result of Belgium's colonial endeavors in Africa, in the Congo. And one of the things that I learned during the research is those familiar kind of snake-like shapes that we've all seen in Art Nouveau paintings and on Art Nouveau buildings is called a whiplash. And that shape comes specifically from images of the whips used to assault the Congolese during the Belgian occupation of the Congo. And so, in other words, these exquisitely beautiful shapes evoke horror.
Yeah.
And what do we do with that? Because we can look at one of those paintings and still be deeply moved by them. Or I can look at those pieces of glass that sit on my parents' shelves and appreciate them as this beautiful aesthetic vessels. But they also contain that horror. And I never would have reached that discovery if I hadn't done the research. So the research taught me everything about where the essay was supposed to go. And so that's why I believe, like, if we trust the research, it will take us to where the writing wants to be, either accidentally or because our subconsciouses will lead us there.
Oh, that's a beautiful answer, Jehanne. I really like that. I don't want to ignore our participants who have questions in the chat, so I'll start with this one, if that's all right. This is a question for Brian, but I actually think it applies to both of you. It says, given that Brian is considering a third essay about his mother, do you think writing about these events has helped you process your grief? And how do you draw the line between art and therapy, or is art therapy?
I know we can both lean into this question.
Yes.
For myself, there's not enough time to really talk about, but just a few short thoughts on that. One, with the essay, I'm not sure if I'll write that other section. I just think I have a feeling it might happen, but it's already in the book, The Wild Delight of Wild Things, but that doesn't mean the meditation is over, And I guess that's like in the writing of this particular book, The Wild Delight of Wild Things, I didn't step out of the end of the book. Well, when I finished the book, like usual, I wonder if this is similar for you too, Jean, but when I finished it, I didn't want to leave this book. I didn't want to finish it and be out of it, because as difficult as it is, it's a conversation with Elise, and I wanted to stay in that conversation. But the writing didn't really get anything off my chest. So I didn't feel cathartic in that sense. It didn't feel like I was lighter when I stepped out of the book. But I have noticed, if I look back to my first book, Here Bullet, I wrote that while I was in a very difficult situation. I was a soldier in a combat zone, writing those poems in my notebooks. The writing of the poems didn't relieve what drove me to the page and the energy that I was writing with and about. But I have noticed now that there's been almost 20 years now since the publication of the book, I've noticed that reading that book and sharing those, I think the act of sharing story, there's a healthy, beneficial aspect oftentimes, if it's in the right conditions and situation, the settings. And I found there's a cumulative effect over time of reading those poems where I feel lighter, in a sense, if that makes sense. When I teach in my own practice, like for example, the VA had me early on trying to do a project with them, where we'd go into VA medical centers and create writing. They were trying to do a nationwide project and have a bunch of these pop-up writing workshops and stuff. But I was, and they were adamant about this too, but I felt very, very comfortable with this idea, because they would have someone like me come in as a writing person. I'd come in with those skills, but I'm not a therapist. I'm not trained in that. And so I really prefer if it gets to that, then there's a trained professional in the room, which is really tricky because I teach a lot of workshops all over the country. I teach an MFA program, and it gets into like some of the deepest stuff of our emotional and just our human lives. It's messy and human, and I'm trying to work at it from a point of as a human being who is an artist with the imagination. And it's like, how do we learn to write the way into the rest of our lives? And that's where I come from.
Yeah, it's funny. I was just writing for this craft book. I just last week was writing my belief that the poem is a post-traumatic document. So it's very hard to write mid-trauma. And that even when we read poems that feel like they're mimetic of the traumatized mind, that is, they imitate the sensation of being inside trauma, it's very hard to create that effect if you're actually in the trauma while you're doing it. So I think the act of containing ideas in little like say 14-line sized documents can be really helpful, but it isn't therapeutic. It can be intellectually engaging, but that work is very hard to do if you're mid-trauma. So what I advocate for is that people, receive therapy or work with a trauma-informed writing coach if they're going to try to do this work. Or once you feel like the wound has healed, then you try to write about it. I think a lot about the scholar Erich Auerbach, who wrote the book Mimesis, and he was a German philologist who wrote the book while he was in exile because the Nazis had chased him out of Germany. And he's writing a book about like how you read, basically, how you read closely, and what are some of the effects that literature produces. So it doesn't seem on the surface like he's writing about trauma, but the first thing he writes about in the book is Odysseus returning to Odyssey after 20 years away at war. And he writes about the moment when Odysseus, who's disguised as a beggar, is discovered, his true identity is discovered by the old nursemaid who once took care of him. She's bathing his feet, a gesture of hospitality, and she discovers the scar on his leg. And it's a scar from decades ago when he was wounded by a boar. And of course, it's Homer, so we get this incredible flashback that's dozens of pages. And so this is really a moment in Homer about trauma. And about trauma, after all, comes from the idea of the word for wound. Originally, trauma was connected to a literal wound on your body. And so my theory is that we can only write often, we can only really get to the thing we want to say once the wound has begun to heal. And maybe it's even scabbed over. Maybe it's even scarred like Odysseus's wound on his leg. That's the time when we can begin to approach this and use the creativity and intellectual detachment, the pairing of those two things that we need in order to make a piece of art.
If you don't mind, I'll put in the chat. I went to Sweden at one point. I went to there's a clinic there for those have experienced torture and war crimes and things like that. And so here's a link to that place. And I wanted to learn from them and talk with them, but I found that it felt I was too obtrusive. I don't know what the right word is. Like, I didn't have the right enough time with them to be able to create a conversation that I could then share with others, so we might replicate what they're doing. But there are other places, even in the United States too. They're almost always really connected under banners of like PTSD and war related stuff. But the word torture rarely seems to show up in American centers that deal with things like this. So that's an intriguing just fact, it seems to me.
So we've had some really good questions here, and we've covered some of the questions that have been in the chat, because they've been about art and trauma and how whether or not writing helps you work through your own sense of trauma or your own sense of loss. And, do you have any, we're approaching the end of our evening, but do you have any words for people who are looking for poets or another book to read about that? Brian, I saw you posted one thing in the chat. Jehanne, do you have anything that you'd like to offer people? Something that you think they should turn to? Poets, essayists.
Well, I think one of the questions we'd been asked earlier was about books that we thought people should read that maybe they haven't thought to read. And these aren't specifically books about trauma, but these are 3 poetry collections that I've been reading recently that I think are wonderful. So the first is from the Unsung Masters series, and it's Burt Myers. And it was edited by Dana Levin. And so the Unsung Master series is a series that focuses on poets who maybe have fallen out of public view, but who are worth consideration. And then I wanted to suggest this beautiful new book by my dear colleague, Corey Marks, The Rock That Is Not a Rabbit. And it's got this great rabbit on the cover. And he's just a wonderful poet who perfectly blends the narrative and the lyric. And then finally, I want to sing the praise of Romantic Comedy by James Allen Hall. There's such a wonderful poet who speaks so beautifully about queerness and humor and trauma, blending all of those things together.
Oh, thank you. Brian, how about you?
Yeah, well, I was going to ask, and this is putting one of our attendees here on the spot, but Randy Brown, I don't know if you have a link at your fingertips you might be able to drop in, because I know you have a lot of links to a lot of great resources. And if you do have something like that handy, Randy, that'd be wonderful. I'm just tempted to this is some of my favorite poetry books over here. This is my to-do list reading that's stacked a couple deep, But I think one of my teachers, it's hard. There are poets who at some points seem to have a sort of national sort of bandwidth or something. And then there are these regional poets who at this point maybe are really well known and loved in their area, but don't seem to have yet come out. But there's Corinne Clegg Hales, her name, she goes by Connie, a beautiful poet, an amazing person. She's my first real poetry teacher, and still is my poetry teacher. And you know, I'm still trying to learn from her. She's amazing. You know, there's a poet who I love, who many of you probably know well, but just in case, I feel like she lived, her life was cut short. And Linda Hull, just an amazing poet. I remember Elise at one point was writing her first book, and she was working through that, and I handed her a volume of Linda Hull, and she started reading it, and she shut it, and she was like, I can't read this right now. This is going to be throwing me off my book. You know, I have to, it was like, it was too much in a certain way, you know. So what an amazing writer. And Kellen Forshey, yes, what you've heard is true. You know, the anthology, whether you read the anthology or not, I think you should, but Against Forgetting, the initial essay that starts that book is foundational for, and it's really connected. It's one of the foundation stones, I think, of this entire conversation, maybe. And I feel like maybe I presume that most people have read it nowadays. So heard that poem, The Colonel, is in a broadside over my desk in my office. And it's kind of a daunting challenge, like try to write something like that, you know, try to say something true, you know. And there's just, I guess, you know, Kat, I love it. But again, like even right here, I'll go to this one right here. This is Next Step in the Shoot, Paisley Rectal's.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I haven't read it yet. I feel embarrassed, but it's on it's the next step there. Right after that is Campbell McGrath's Fever of Unknown Origin. Now, Campbell, one thing I love about Campbell is it's just a really, in terms of form, book length form, he is so, I mean, he's a poet I would really recommend reading from his first book to the most current, because you can see a poet who takes big, large scale challenges and sees them through to an end. You know, there'll be a journey thing. He did one book that's a poem for every year of the 1900s, right? And it just, each time he has a new challenge that's really fascinating. So I could go on and on, but there's just so many writers to read, both for crafts and art, but also for saying things that need to be said, you know.
Oh, absolutely. Brian, Jean, these are really helpful lists. Somebody's asking, yeah, somebody posted, it's Against Forgetting, the Carolyn Forshey. Right. Okay, so we have that. So I want to thank both of you for this brilliant conversation. I really wish we were sitting in a living room, all of us on couches with hot chocolate or a drink or something like that, so we could go on for hours. I know I could, but I do need to announce the winner of the Journal of the Month Club raffle, and it is oh wow, it's Gail Hosking. Gail, are you here? Gail, all right. I can't quite see if you're here.
I'm here.
Oh, she is. Oh, Gail, wonderful. I will email you and get your address so that we can enter all that information for a Journal of the Month Club, and you will have literary magazines to read. And as both Jean and Brian know, literary magazines are the lifeblood of writers, as are book publications. I encourage all of you to go out and purchase Brian's book, purchase Jean's book. They're really phenomenal books. Brian, as you know, had 3 of them this fall. And Jean's book is just this one. I couldn't put it down. I couldn't put any of these books down. So my pile of books, which you cannot see behind me, is like taller than I am. And I'm not that tall, but I'm tall enough. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone, for coming this evening. Bye now.